So we've talked a lot about some issues that come up with IHRA and the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and how to incorporate that, and a lot of accusations behind it. And who better than to address these issues of legality than a panel of lawyers. So I have the pleasure of introducing the legal issues surrounding the definition of anti-Semitism with Liora from Stop Anti-Semitism, Susan Tuchman from ZOA, and Mark Goldfeder from Jewish Advocacy Center, and Dr. Mark Goldfeder from Jewish Advocacy Center, and Arsen Ostrovsky from Israel Legal Forum. So thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Outstanding, and of course, we're always happy. You know, our students need to know that there is no shortage of Jewish lawyers if they need one. So now I would like to address my first question to Mark. Mark, thank you for joining here today. And I know that we've been working closely on a few cases of adopting the IHRA definition in De Anza College in the Bay Area, where it wasn't successful, and in a few of the campuses in Georgia. Some of the questions that we hear often, it's that if the IHRA definition is not legally binding, so how does it really help us, or how does it really make a difference for our campuses? That's one question. And the second part of my question to you is that I spent the time to read the 77-page paper that you have published. I do encourage everyone to do the same, and I learned a lot. Can you please tell us a little bit about your findings there? And I believe if you can touch specifically on the finding that 80% of a community, it means that they're wrong. And there is a few other examples that I would go into detail later on.
Sure. First of all, I want to just thank Elon and the entire SSI team for this conference and for all the great work that you do. You know, we hear a lot of critique about the IHRA definition on campus, most of it quite unfounded. But one thing I think isn't normally talked about or talked about enough is what IHRA actually does and why it does it that way and why it works. And so to get to the answers to your question, I want to just take a minute to talk about not why IHRA is so important, but why IHRA is actually so good. I'll start with an observation from the late Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs Zatzal, who believed that in terms of its focus, anti-Semitism often looks at Jews as a collective. The idea being that while individual Jews might be tolerable, Jews as a separate collective identity should not be allowed to exist with the same rights as other groups. And that's why the majority of anti-Semitism in any given era tends to focus on the primary form of collective Jewish identity at that point in history. So for example, throughout the Middle Ages, Jews are for the most part a religious community, and they're hated for their religion, even if the particular Jews that are being oppressed weren't religiously Jewish. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when many Jews became secularized, the primary unifying collective identity of Jews was their ethnicity. So the hatred mutated to focus on race, even when it was only trace amounts of Jewish blood. Today, when the primary collective embodiment of Jewish people on the world stage is the people of Israel and their nation state, Jews around the world are hated and held accountable for their state, even if they're not Israeli. So the practical problem in defining anti-Semitism is that it is a mutating virus. Jews are criticized for whatever a society or a particular part of society hates at that particular moment. The right will call them radicals, the left will say they're fundamentalists. You know, they're too liberal, too conservative, they're too rich, they're a drain on society, they're too strong, too weak, too influential, too parasitical. A definition of anti-Semitism that can encompass all of these possibilities and many more need to be able to cut through the timely rationales that are given for this timeless hatred. Because if you don't, anti-Semites will just find another rationale and use that one to oppress you. So if we want to actually protect people practically, you need a definition that focuses not on the reasons why people hate, but on the actions taken by those expressing or harboring hatred. A praxeological or a conduct-based definition. And the definition that serves this goal best is the IHRA definition. And it is precisely because the examples that it gives focus on the manifestations of anti-Semitism, meaning what anti-Semites do as opposed to why they do it. That's what makes IHRA such a good definition. Yes, its strength comes with a consensus of tens of thousands of people across every spectrum agreeing that it represents their shared lived experience. But the way IHRA does that, the reason people feel that way is because while anti-Semites around the world may give different reasons for their feelings, those feelings tend to manifest themselves in similar repetitive patterns. So the pushback that you mentioned, the main pushback on adopting IHRA more broadly, comes from the fact that among those lists of potentially anti-Semitic behavior provided, the definition includes some useful examples of discriminatory anti-Israel acts that can sometimes cross the line into anti-Semitism. And critics challenge the use of IHRA in policymaking on two main grounds. First, they say that it conflates political speech against Israel with anti-Semitism. That part's simply not true. There's actually a safe harbor provision in the IHRA definition, as many have pointed out, which says that criticism for Israel leveled out similar to that leveled against any other country is not anti-Semitism. But the critics say that that's not sufficient because there may be very good non-anti-Semitic reasons why a person wants to single out Israel from among all the other countries and hold them to a different standard. And to those critics, I say, great, read the definition. It never says that all of these examples are always anti-Semitic. Your concern is precisely why the definition includes the explicit caveat that all the examples given, including the ones about Israel, could, taking into account the overall context, be considered anti-Semitic. Context is crucial here, as it is in all instances of alleged legal discrimination. Anti-Semitism is no different, for example, than racism or sexism, in that context matters, and no two cases are ever exactly the same. The reason the specific examples are provided in IHRA is explicitly not because all forms of criticism about Israel are anti-Semitic, and the definition takes pains to make that clear. It's precisely because there are those who claim that no criticism of Israel can ever cross that line. The second objection to using the IHRA definition in a policy context is that in the wrong hands, it could theoretically be used to stifle speech. And that is a completely valid argument, but ultimately completely misleading, because the correct conclusion from that concern isn't don't use IHRA, it's don't use IHRA incorrectly. Of course, this kind of policymaking has to be done carefully because free speech is a core aspect of democracy, and there is no general hate speech exception for anti-Semitism or any other kind of hatred. That is precisely why the policies we're talking about don't take the form of a speech code. Everyone on both sides agrees with that principle, and it's a red herring to pretend that that's an issue, because the policies we're talking about don't involve speech. They involve discriminatory harassment and criminal conduct, and those are not forms of protected speech. Unlike speech, that kind of conduct is absolutely subject to government regulation. You might ask, how do you know which conduct can be regulated? Turns out there's an answer. Well-established Supreme Court precedent requires that behavior be objectively offensive in order to fall under the category of discriminatory harassment. How do you know if a type of behavior meets an objectively offensive standard? You'd have to use an objectively well-accepted definition. From a First Amendment perspective, you don't want each school making up its own definition of anti-Semitism so that no one knows what is or is not going to be problematic. You want clarity, and the IHRA definition is the closest to a world consensus that we have ever gotten and are ever likely to get. So a policy using the IHRA definition to contextually assess motivation behind potential illegal discriminatory conduct, in fact, ensures that the law against discrimination will not be applied arbitrarily. It gives an objective and clear definition of what anti-Semitism is for the purpose of discouraging subjective enforcement. So now we get to your question, if IHRA isn't legally binding, why is it worth adopting it? Well, again, the first answer is regardless of its legal impact, it serves an important educational function. But what it also does is what we just explained. Without creating any new law, it plugs a hole in existing anti-discrimination law. And that's where we get to policies like the executive order on combating anti-Semitism, which is very often misunderstood. Under Title VI, recipients of federal funding, like most universities, are required to ensure that their programs are free from harassment, intimidation, and discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Thanks in large part to the work of Ken Marcus in 2004, the Department of Education clarified that Title VI includes anti-Semitism to the extent that it implicates ethnic or ancestral bias. But it's important to remember that even under Title VI, not all forms of harassing behavior are illegal. It's only when it is based on an illegal discriminatory intent. And the problem for the Office of Civil Rights was, without a definition of anti-Semitism to use as a reference, how do you determine if it's illegal anti-Semitic intent? In practice, what that meant was students on campus, Jewish students on campus, were always vulnerable to attack and then obfuscation, because people would just deny motivation and say, it wasn't based on anti-Semitism. It was based on, for example, anti-Zionism. So what OCR needed was, as the Supreme Court would say, a definition of behavior that was objectively anti-Semitic, and that is what the executive order did. And I'll end by saying something very important, which is the executive order didn't create any new law. And despite what critics would have you believe, this kind of executive order is not at all uncommon. On his very first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order clarifying that gender identity and sexual orientation are to be treated as sex-based classes protected under Title VII. Just like President Trump, he wasn't creating new laws. He was just clarifying how the federal government understands and applies the definitions existing already in anti-discrimination law. That's why adopting IHRA is so important, because it plugs a hole in existing anti-discrimination law. That's all the executive order on anti-Semitism did. It didn't limit speech because it only deals with conduct. And rather than muddying the water, it clarified it and ensured that the law would not be applied arbitrarily.
Oh, and Dr. Mike, thank you so much for this answer. Honestly, golden standard answer. I did write a few follow-up questions that we'll be returning to you after we'll hear from the rest of the speakers with those questions. So thank you very much. Like, very clear, outstanding. I learned.
Definitely, and some great key points there that kind of segue into my question for Susan, who actually worked with me when I was a student. I'm meeting so many people on here that I've worked with in the past. But Susan, can you share a little bit about what the work ZOA has done to include the IHRA definition in the executive order that we were just discussing, signed in 2019 by President Trump, and what legal consequences it has for universities and Jewish students, and how the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism also relates to it?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I'm so happy to be here with you and everyone at SSI today. We're really proud at ZOA to partner with SSI in our work on campus. As many of you know, the IHRA definition has become something of a lightning rod even in the Jewish community. And the same thing is true of the executive order that you referred to in your question. So I'd like to explain a little bit about what the executive order actually does and why it and the IHRA definition it includes are so important. As you'll see, despite what their critics claim, the executive order and the IHRA definition are not new. They're not radical concepts. They provide tools that have been in use for many years already, and they're enormously helpful to the federal agencies that enforce our anti-discrimination laws, to universities, and to Jewish students. The full name of the executive order is the Executive Order on Combating Anti-Semitism. And as you mentioned, President Trump issued it in December 2019. The executive order essentially does three things. First, it commits our government to fighting anti-Semitism, particularly at schools and on college campuses. Second, the executive order requires that a federal law called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act be enforced to protect Jewish students from ethnic discrimination at federally funded programs. Most colleges and universities, even private ones, receive some sort of federal funding, and so they have to comply with Title VI. Third, the executive order says that when federal agencies enforce Title VI, they must consider the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. So why all of the criticism of this executive order and the IHRA definition? Why are they both painted as radical and dangerous developments? Well, critics claim that if the IHRA definition is used in Title VI cases, then free speech will be squelched and people will be penalized under the law for criticizing Israel. These claims are not true. At the ZOA, we've been using Title VI to protect Jewish students from harassment and discrimination since 2004. In fact, we filed the first anti-Semitism case under Title VI that the Office for Civil Rights ever agreed to investigate. Now, the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR for short, is the federal agency in the US Department of Education that's responsible for enforcing Title VI. Since that 2004 case, we have filed several Title VI actions with the Office for Civil Rights. And I can tell you that this law has never been enforced to silence speech that's critical of Israel. It can't be enforced that way. Title VI must be enforced consistent with the First Amendment. That's true even now that federal agencies must consider the IHRA definition when they resolve Title VI cases. Just like the executive order, there's all this fuss about using the IHRA definition. It's radical, it's dangerous. Again, not true. Years before there was an IHRA definition, the State Department was using a working definition of anti-Semitism that was very similar to the IHRA definition. Both definitions recognized that demonizing Israel, holding Israel to a double standard that no other country is held to, and denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination could all be manifestations of anti-Semitism. For years, the ZOA was encouraging the Office for Civil Rights to use these important definitions of anti-Semitism. In Title VI cases, it would have a frame of reference for understanding when criticism of Israel might actually be masking anti-Semitism. Our efforts finally paid off in 2018. One of our Title VI cases triggered the Office for Civil Rights to decide that when it analyzes Title VI cases alleging anti-Semitism, OCR would now consider the IHRA definition. That was in 2018. About a year later, President Trump affirmed that policy in that executive order, and he required that all federal agencies that enforce Title VI consider the IHRA definition. This should benefit Jewish students and lead to better, more effective enforcement of Title VI. In my experience, most of the anti-Semitism that Jewish students are facing on their college campuses relates to Zionism in Israel. Just as an example, we worked with students at UC Irvine. They endured posters posted around the campus that compared Israeli leaders to Nazis. Students were subjected to displays of the Israeli flag defaced with a swastika, smeared with what looked like blood. Students couldn't avoid this huge sign on the main walkway of the campus, which said in huge block letters, "Israelis love to kill innocent children." Similar problems at Hunter College. We worked with Jewish students there who endured being screamed at a protest that was really supposed to be screaming things like "Zionists go home," "Zionists out of CUNY." One Jewish student heard someone screaming, "We should drag the Zionists down the street." At Rutgers University, we worked with Jewish students there who were forced to pay an admission fee to an anti-Israel event that was advertised as free and open to the public. One of the organizers of this event said that the admission fee was necessary because, and this is a quote, 150 Zionists showed up at this event. For years, OCR had no tools for understanding when this kind of anti-Israel and anti-Zionist conduct crossed the line into anti-Semitism. There were no guidelines for distinguishing between legitimate political discourse and anti-Israelism that was really a mask for anti-Jewish bigotry. During the investigation of one of our Title VI cases, it really hit home for me that not everyone understands what Zionism means. Not everyone understands that for many Jews, our connection to our religious and our ancestral homeland is an integral part of our Jewish identity. During this particular Title VI investigation, one investigator kept tripping over the word Zionist when she said the name of my organization. It obviously wasn't a word she was familiar with. And it dawned on me that if she didn't know how to say the word, the investigator probably didn't understand the meaning of the word either. Yet, as all of you know, the word Zionist is so often misused and abused on college campuses. Anti-Semitism is a form of anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism is critical to addressing these campus problems. Now, having the IHRA definition as a guide, OCR will have a better appreciation of how anti-Semitism is expressed today, especially on college campuses, so that it can more effectively address the problem. Again, using the definition does not and cannot change the legal standards for enforcing Title VI. The definition will not make it unlawful to criticize Israel. Also, the executive order and the IHRA definition it includes sends an important message to colleges and universities that they must address all forms of anti-Semitism, including when the anti-Semitism involves Israel. That should lead to a safer and more welcoming environment for Jewish and pro-Israel students.
Thank you, Susan, and I couldn't agree more with you on that statement. We're also very thankful for our partnership with ZOA, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next question is to Arsen. We'd like you to address a couple, multifaceted question. So if you could tell us the International Legal Forum's work in order to help adopt IHRA, the working definition of anti-Semitism around the world, or discuss IHRA within the European Parliament, and also what are some practical ways that students can apply the definition on their campus?
Thank you for that. That's definitely quite a few questions to cover in a short time, so I'll do my best. But first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank all the incredible work that SSI is doing, not only standing up and supporting Israel, but really being in the front line in the campaign fighting back against anti-Semitism. So what you are doing in terms of empowering students, empowering not only leaders of tomorrow, but leaders of today, I think is inspiring. I think it's brave, and I think it's absolutely necessary. And I see from all the successes and victories you've had that you're making a real difference. So for that, I wanted to first of all thank you. On my behalf, it's really an honor to be here also with our other panelists here, whom I consider not only colleagues, but also friends. I think that first of all, I'd say that irrespective of what position we may take individually or collectively, politically, I think all of us are here because we're united in one pursuit, and that is fighting back against anti-Semitism. And I think this unity, whether we come from the left or from the right, is something that is absolutely crucial and critical. We have seen that this is not left or right issue. Both the Trump administration supported the IHRA definition, and the Biden administration has recently said that they enthusiastically endorse it as well. So this isn't left or right, but it's an American issue. So I think that's important to stress. I think, I would say that quite simply, unless we can define what it is we're trying to defeat, we cannot defeat it. That's as simple as that. I actually originally did have Rabbi Sachs's quote in mind, but Mark took that from me. But I think that's okay. I mean, I do use that quite honestly in a lot of the presentations that I make, because I think it is so relevant, because he does talk about the fact that, it's not, it was at a time when they came at us because of our race, then a religion, and now it's our nation state. And when Rabbi Sachs made this speech, it was actually in the European Parliament itself. When you're drawing back to Europe, it was in 2016. And the speech was actually titled "The Mutating Virus." And, we're in an era of viruses and pandemics today. And the fact that Rabbi Sachs, not only the chief rabbi, but one of the great thinkers of the Jewish world, was able to succinctly sort of describe this as a virus that has mutated through the ages. But at the end of the day, this hatred has endured. It just manifests itself in different shapes and forms. So in reality, it never died. It's just transformed itself. Today, it's no longer politically fashionable or correct to openly direct your hatred against Jews, certainly not in Europe, certainly not in intellectual circles. But what we're seeing, we're seeing this anti-Semitism, which has become morphed into anti-Zionism. It's becoming increasingly clever and manipulative in their tactics. We've seen that, for example, through some of the alternate definitions that have come across in recent weeks, where we see this sort of masquerading of anti-Semitism in purported language of human rights, of the words like peace and liberty and justice, but essentially it's no more than false claims and malicious distortions of truth disguised as some kind of supposed or purported acceptable criticism of Israel or Zionism, which it certainly is not. So IHRA offers, I think, the most objective tool for elected officials, for student bodies, which is most critical from your perspective here, from legal professionals in terms of, it's not a legal document as Mark as I think said so eloquently, but from our perspective, it's an educational document. It educates all these different bodies, from students to officials and policymakers, what is anti-Semitism. It doesn't prescribe hate speech, but what it does is that, and you can still make that kind of speech, but it does open you to rejection and ridicule and being called out for the actions that you have taken. And I think that is also something that's critical, crucial point to make. In terms of some things that we are doing from across sort of different fields, I would say on the one hand, it's important to educate the legal community. ILF is a network of over 3,000 lawyers in over 30 countries around the world. Each country has different laws on what is free speech, what is hate speech. We know that over 30 countries have now adopted the IHRA definition. A host of multilateral organizations, institutions, we've seen even Bahrain adopt it. And by the way, Bahrain adopted the full IHRA definition, all its accompanying examples, which is quite interesting when you're seeing in some campuses and some groups today, including in the United States, where there is a philosophical discussion and debate on what is anti-Semitism, what isn't anti-Semitism, is IHRA too far or not. Here you have an increasing number of people in the Arab world who know very well what anti-Semitism is, saying that, yes, we support it, yes, we endorse it. So that is something that is really quite breathtaking to see. So from a legal perspective, I think it's important, and as we do, to educate the legal community, those who are not familiar with the existence of IHRA definition, let alone its content, let alone its accompanying examples, how it can be used. We help train these professionals to identify what is an anti-Semitism. When we talk about academics, and again, we're discussing sort of the campus environment here, so much of this discussion that we're having, it stems from the, if you look like a pyramid, it stems from the academics. It stems from the university professors, and it flows down to students. The students who are bearing the brunt and really on the front line of this, relentless intimidation and hatred and racism. And, it's critical to provide them with necessary tools. I'll give you one example. Just recently in the last week, if you saw, and something we were certainly very much involved with in terms of supporting different allies. SSI supported this as well, and many more. There was a group of academics, over 500 now, from around the world, that signed an open letter calling or showing their support for the IHRA definition. And these academics came from all across the political spectrum, from the left wing, the right wing, in between, but they were united in the need and the importance of the IHRA tool as an indispensable tool in the fight against anti-Semitism, and specifically in the way it's been used, in the way anti-Semitism has been used as a singling out Zionism, singling out Jewish people's right to self-determination, and the way the state of Israel has been focused as a source of vilification. So that was something really quite incredible to see. These were academics from all over the world, literally from the United States, Canada, Europe as well, the UAE even, and some from even Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and even Pakistan. So something quite incredible to see. We do a lot of work, and it's critical also with the parliamentarians. And I think in that regard, it's necessary to equip Jewish communities and pro-Israel groups in those countries in order for them to be properly informed as well. What is anti-Semitism? Specifically within the IHRA context, how they can use it, not everyone has the United States Constitution, which protects free speech to such strong extent. In Europe, it's a very different battlefield where where such claims can be used far more willingly, I suppose, in terms of the local anti-discrimination laws. So how do they fit in? And lastly, my apologies if I've gone too much over time, Ilan, but to answer your question specifically in terms of students, which is the group that's really watching this today, at the end of the day, this is, I think, is really aimed towards them today. The campus environment today is the main battlefield in terms of anti-Semitism in all its manifestation, not only in the singling out of Jews, but also in the singling out of Israel as the Jewish state or the Jew amongst the nations. So examples that we've used in terms of working with different student bodies and campuses to equip them and provide them with the tools in order to how to apply IHRA, how it can be used. When you see in the University of Toronto, for example, there was a case, Jewish students wanted to have kosher food, but there was a protest against that because it was deemed that kosher food is too pro-Israel, This is kosher food. And that's something, very clearly within the IHRA context, for example, when you take when you sort of apply what Jewish students are doing to the state of Israel or vice versa, you have examples like that. When you have accusations of dual loyalty, which we've seen in Israel Apartheid Week events, some of which in the UK, for example, have been cancelled precisely because of the IHRA definition. And of course, comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, one of the other examples we've seen. So trying to sort of provide students with necessary tools in order to identify how they can actually use IHRA to identify what is anti-Semitism, and then how can they take that to the next level, including with their professors, including with their academic bodies, in terms of taking the next step, and whether that may be repercussions for those involved in these actions, or how they can be used in terms of seeing actual tangible steps being taken in response to that.
For this amazing knowledge and information. We're really grateful to have you here. And now the next question would be going to Liora, the president of Stop Anti-Semitism. And Liora, we know that your organization documents dozens, if not hundreds, different examples of anti-Semitic incidents that happen all over the country. We know that you were working in order to have Facebook adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism together with over 80 other organizations from across the world. Can you tell us how all of those examples, all the anti-Semitism that students face or you see on social media can be fought with the help of some of the people that even spoke here earlier on the panel?
Absolutely. And I can't thank you guys enough for having myself and our organization speak on this at this important summit. I don't think it's a secret that people turn to social media for their news. The days of turning on the TV to find out what's going on around the world are pretty much obsolete and over. Young as 10, old as 90, or older, I should say, we're no longer turning first to CNN, Fox, BBC. From the moment we wake up until we go back to sleep, we scroll Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the younger generation now are scrolling, obviously, TikTok to find out what's going on around us and in our world. So working in social media for 10 years, I became very perplexed as to why none of these social media giants actually had a hate speech policy in place addressing anti-Semitism, something that was spreading like wildfire on all of these massive platforms with billions of users globally. So in August 2020, StopAntisemitism.org led a coalition. It began as 80, as Ilan just said, but we grew it to 145 Jewish and non-Jewish organizations globally, which was an amazing feat, urging Facebook to include the full IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in their hate speech policy. So taking a step back, that previous year, we co-authored a report titled The New Anti-Semites, which exposed the startling similarities between the anti-Semitic BDS movement and far-right movements. Gone were the days where Jew was weaponized. These radical movements brilliantly twisted the old insult of Jew and replaced it with Zionist. However, when 90% of Jews and counting in the diaspora identify as Zionists, the only thing protecting us against this vilification is IHRA, because we know exactly what they mean when they say Zionist. It's code for Jew. So when we look at BDS and their allies, such as If Not Now, Jewish Voices for Peace, and SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, they all masquerade as these social justice movements, but in reality, they do nothing to help Palestinians or marginalized groups. Their sole objective is to vilify the Jew and erase Israel's existence. So one thing that we caught in May of 2019 was that on Facebook, the administrators of a Jewish group, Jewish Voices for Peace, was sitting in Lebanon. So we asked ourselves, why in the world is an admin for, again, quote unquote, a Jewish group sitting in Lebanon? Because these groups are not Jewish. They're nothing but massive frauds using the power of social media to vilify Jews with code words such as Zionist. So when we go back to their goal of essentially erasing Israel's existence, if we think about it for a second, a mere 80 years after a plan was put forth to rid to rid Europe of its Jews, we now have a movement that's being legitimized on college campuses around the world that's committed to removing now the Jewish state from the planet. So going back to our letter, 48 hours after receiving it, we received an email from Sheryl Sandberg announcing that Facebook has actually updated its hate speech policy and thanking us for our much needed letter. She proceeded to tell us that they were banning Holocaust denial and anti-Semitic libels of Jewish world domination, aka we run the banks, we run Hollywood, we run global news media, from their social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram. So while obviously we were happy, this was a very, very long time coming, but we asked ourselves, and actually in a follow-up call with Peter Stern, who's the director of content policy for Facebook, why the social media giant was unwilling to fully adopt IHRA, which again, does not erase anyone's ability to just criticize Israel, but it stops them from calling for the removal of the Jewish state and collectively labels Jews as Nazis. His response was startling. Essentially, their hands were tied, personal beliefs aside. So what does that tell us? Those that are twisting the narratives, for instance, on social media, and keep in mind, I was personally told 10 years ago, social media was not real. However, when we look at the erasure of advertising in traditional mediums, all of advertising has moved to social media. All of our news, as I mentioned previously, has moved to social media, and social justice movements start on social media. The hatred of the state of Israel is fueled by social media. So those twisting the narratives on social media, you know what they've done? They've successfully managed to influence millions of users around the world. And not only that, but they've managed to frighten the top policymakers at Facebook, who were Jewish themselves and Zionists. So stopantisemitism.org, we've successfully amassed a social media following of about 100,000 people across all of our platforms. And Baruch Hashem, our monthly reach is in its million and counting every single month. What we found in our 2019 New Anti-Semites report is exactly what we're seeing manifest more and more on platforms such as TikTok, on top of Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So now children as young as 8, 9, 10 are learning that the word Zionist and Zionism is evil. So while users and society as a whole have no problem disliking and vilifying those who post swastikas or question the Holocaust, obviously that's bad. Again, society has no problem saying that's bad. When Free Palestine is written on a post wishing Jews a happy Passover from a Hillel, that's deemed not as bad. When students complain to their college administrators about professors vilifying Zionists on their Twitter feeds, they're brushed off and told they weren't talking about Jews, they were talking about Zionists. When a law student threatened to set a man on fire at a New York university because he wore an IDF sweatshirt, the law school dean had the audacity to defend her and state she was exercising her First Amendment rights. Again, because she wasn't vilifying Jews, she was an anti-Zionist. So this is where we come in. We hold these new anti-Semites accountable that are spreading their freshly masked Jew hatred. They spread it masked as anti-Semitism, masked as anti-Zionism on social media. We boomerang it back at them, posting their true intentions to spread their Jew hatred using these buzzwords. Again, they don't use Jew, they use Zionist, colonizer, occupier, and Zion Nazi. The only thing that will ever stop this from spreading and continuing to spread on social media is IHRA. And we're working in tandem with multiple organizations to pass this on every college campus possible in America right now.
Well, Liora, as to any speaker before, thank you so much. This panel can continue going for hours because I've been hearing so many things. I would like to ask Sophia, and I will be asking one question each panelist today, and if you can give us an answer in about a minute or under, that would be great. And the first question would be going to Dr. Mark, the president of the Jewish Advocacy Center. Dr. Mark, you spoke to us and you shared with us some outstanding words. Now, how can we bring those words and communicate it to the college student? How can we level it down with those students on the campus who are not so familiar with all the details, probably not even going to take the time to get familiar with so many details, but are still fighting for the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism?
Sure. I mean, the simple answer, honestly, is groups like SSI, groups like the ZOA, and groups like the Brandeis Center, and groups like everybody else on this panel who do that kind of really hard work in the trenches every single day. I do think it is important, though, on a practical level, for students to have one or two go-to examples of the kinds of things that can happen when you don't draw some lines in the sand. My favorite go-to example is what happened in Wuppertal, Germany, just a few years ago. Everyone's very concerned, and rightly so, about the danger of extremists on the far right of anti-Semitism, but people are wrong to think that the worst forms of anti-Semitism have nothing to do with anti-Israel or anti-Zionist sentiment. Again, just a few years ago, and this is a case that students should look up, in Wuppertal, Germany, a synagogue was firebombed, and the culprits avoided jail time because the judge accepted their claim that firebombing a Jewish house of prayer wasn't anti-Semitic. That was how they chose to express their anti-Zionism. Insane, truly, truly insane, and also true. So it's important to have a few go-to examples. So when someone says, that could never happen, could it happen here? Of course it could happen here. Not one, not two, not three, not four, 5 Chabad houses were set fire to last year. Okay, not all of them were charged with anti-Semitism, but a lot of the circumstances were murky. Could it happen here? As Susan said a few minutes ago, not only could it happen here, it does happen here. And of course, after Wuppertal, Germany adopted the IHRA definition that tells you everything that you need to know.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Mark. My next question would be to Susan. We discussed a little bit at CUNY school and all the anti-Semitic incidents that happened there. We know that ZIA was involved in there as well. And we know that today, the student senate at CUNY will be voting on a resolution that I'm holding in front of me to condemn the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And shockingly enough, one of the co-signers on the resolution is the Jewish Law Student Association, together with Students for Justice in Palestine. What do we do? If this is the case, what do we do?
What do we do, Elon? It is so challenging. We see this all the time. We see Jewish students who are members of Students for Justice in Palestine. In fact, we've seen, on one of the campuses we did work on, the president of the SJP chapter was a Jewish student, and they tend to use that to say to us, well, how can we be anti-Semitic because we're Jews? It's a huge challenge that we're facing, and I just think it speaks to how important SSI's work is on campus, how important ZOA's work is on campus, to educate students, to talk to them about the IHRA definition, what it means, what it will accomplish, to address the concerns about the IHRA definition, these made-up lies about the IHRA definition that groups like SJP are promoting on campus. It really highlights how hard we have to work to reach students, and not just Jewish students, women's groups, gay groups, the Asian students, all the communities on campus, to make them understand why it's so important that we appreciate in how many ways subtle and more blatant anti-Semitism is being expressed today on college campuses.
Thank you very much, Susan. And my next question will go to Arsen. So I'm not sure if some of the people know, but you were living for quite a few years in Australia. And earlier, about a week or two ago, I had a conversation with the Australian Jewish Student Union, with the president there and a few leaders from the Australian Student Union. And clearly everything that we are facing, they're facing as well. So the problem here is similar in Australia, in the UK, in the United States, in Canada, anywhere you go, same issue. What can we do in order to, again, support those students? Same case, different scenarios, but same, what can we do there?
In 3 words, education, education, education. Look, I did grow up in Australia before moving to Israel, and it shows you nowhere on earth is immune from anti-Semitism or the virus of Jew hatred. And not Australia, not the US, not Canada, not Europe, nowhere. But I think at the end of the day, the way we approach it needs to be the same, irrespective of where the student body is. We need to show the students that they have our support. This comes from the Jewish community, I think, and the pro-Israel community at large. We need to provide them with the adequate tools to understand and learn and identify how to actually use this arsenal of responses and tools at their disposal, to know how to identify anti-Semitism, to know how to approach their professors, how to approach their deans. At the end of the day, we need them to know that they're not alone, and we need to work with them in order to help them identify all the tools that are available and how they can ultimately use them. In other words, we need to empower them and educate them.
Thank you, Arsen. And then my last question would go to Liora. When students face anti-Semitism online, they're being bullied or arrested or elsewhere, what's your suggestion? What can they do in order to fight on? Can they approach you, or can they document that incident?
Absolutely, anytime they can approach us. We find when these incidents are boomerang back and we hold the universities accountable, we see more action. We always tell our social media followers, if you want to report it to campus police, go ahead. But we personally feel it's a waste of time. Campus police are there to protect the university, in our opinions, not the students. We suggest always contacting local police. You get a paper trail, you get it on social media. We had a local incident in Connecticut just over Passover alone, there were 3 anti-Semitic incidents, totaling 8 total for this academic school year. The administration was too busy following the NCAA March Championships and how amazing the women's sports team was doing. So they did their best to hide everything and brush it under the rug until we started tweeting about it. And we got the attention of the tri-state media sources. And then finally, the university issued a statement which stated they were just made aware. They were then called out subsequently on social media by UConn students saying that they've been aware. So again, once they're being held accountable to do something, this is the only time when it won't be swept under the rug. So I cannot say this enough. Contact us and social media, social media, social media. This is exactly when you're going to see action.
All right. First of all, to the entire team here, thank you very much. Liora, Susan, Dr. Mark, and Arsen, we learned a lot from you. I know that in Students Supporting Israel over the past years, dozens, if not more, of our students who graduated from undergrad continued to law school. And I hope that our organization will be able to produce a future generation of Jewish leaders, Zionist leaders, who many of them are lawyers, to continue this fight on and off our campus grounds. So thank you very much for joining us.